Welcome to the 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Rachel Goldberg-Polin about her book, When We See You Again. Rachel writes with stunning clarity about pain and about love in the wake of her son Hersh's kidnapping on October 7th and his murder 330 days later.
It really was not a decision to write the book. It was trying to perform CPR on myself, and I was really just trying to get out and describe, even if it was just for myself, what am I experiencing?
In this episode, we'll talk with Rachel about how she lives with grief and how she has read Robert Frost with new eyes.
I recently was rethinking how Robert Frost talks about the only way out is through. And I was thinking about his poem about being in the forest when it's snowing. He wants to lay down in the forest. He wants this to be over. And then I looked up and did some research on Robert Frost and found out that he lost 4 of his children in his lifetime.
And we'll hear her hope to find Shabbat again.
In Lecha Dodi, the second verse says, Likrat Shabbat lechu v'nilcha, come, we're going to go greet Shabbat, ki hi makor habracha, because Shabbat is the essence, the soul, the source, the core of all of our blessings. That verse always meant a lot to me, but what I'm trying to do now is move on to the third verse, which says, Rav lach shevet be'emek habacha. You've sat too long in the valley of tears. V'hu yachmal alai chemla. And God is going to compassion you with compassion.
All that and more coming up next. Welcome to the 5 Books, Rachel. Thank you for making the time. Before we begin talking about books, I want to say that for so many of us, and especially for me, we have been profoundly changed by Hersh and by you and John. We all watched you both travel all over to the United Nations, to television studios, to meetings with, as you put it, very important people, anyone who might help bring Hersh home, and any of the descriptors like fighting tirelessly, they just feel cliche compared to what you were actually doing. You were working every waking moment to bring home your son who was stolen from the Nova Festival. And then the worst happened. Hersh was executed in the Gaza tunnels along with what we've come to know as the Beautiful Six. And you and John somehow continued, and you've used this platform. You continued to fight for the other hostages, to bring them home until the day that Ron Vili was finally brought home to rest. And now you've written When We See You Again. It felt to me less like a book and more like a soul portal. It felt like a modern lamentation. We're speaking a few weeks before Tisha B'Av, where we read the keynote, the Lamentations. And just reading it knocked me sideways. I felt like as readers, you brought us deeper into the holiness of the world, into the cruelty and the tenderness and the unbearable weight of love and loss. And you write in the book, what can I do that doesn't feel unbearable? I can tell things, tell pain, describe it all, even when the words don't exist. So can you tell me about the decision to write this book?
It really was not a decision to write the book. It was trying to perform CPR on myself or do the Heimlich on myself. I was just choking from this debilitating, buckling suffering and pain that is not unique to me. I'm very aware that millions of people around the world have buried children, and millions of people every single day are suffering in different ways, whether it's through death of a loved one or all the different things that come our way in this human enterprise of loss and grief and pain. And My problem was that I think what I've come to understand is that the 330 days before Hersh was killed, we were trying so hard and bifurcating ourselves in order to be able to function to try to save him and to save these other hostages. And in order to do that, we were compartmentalizing so much of our trauma and anguish and horror. We were going through this sort of slow motion terrorist attack ourselves and pushing so much down within ourselves. And then we got this horrific news on, the night between day 330 and 331. And I think that there was no more room. I was choking from missing him so much and loving Hersh so much and trying to suppress that until he came home so that I could just drench him in all of that. And then all of a sudden, there was this humongous, unimaginable hit. And so what was stuck in me needed to come out just as a way for me to stop actively dying. We're all dying, but it felt like it was imminent. And John said, you need to tip over and spill this out. And I think what ended up happening was I was pouring out these packages of love that were frosted in pain. Or I've said, this is a pain letter that is doused in love. And I was really just trying to get out and describe, even if it was just for myself, what am I experiencing? And then it sort of morphed into becoming the answer to when so many kind, benevolent people say, how are you? Which is always crushing for me. I don't know. It's the most perplexing question for me because I am so broken. It's such an innocuous, kind-hearted question. But that was the evolution of what happened. And then I ended up meeting this woman and she was saying, you must write a book. And I said, I can't write a book. I can only write pain. This is what I have. And I showed her and she said, this is a book. And I said, really? Because it just feels like a bunch of pain. And so it wasn't, I can reverse engineer a tale as if I, sat down and decided I'm going to take brick and mortar and construct a book of grief. But it completely happened quite organically within the excruciation that I was experiencing.
That is, I think, what I meant when I said a soul portal. Like it felt like you just kind of unzipped your heart and gave it to us. And thank you for sharing it with us. Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood. Bible Stories for Jewish Children by Ruth Samuels.
So I grew up in a family that was not Jewishly observant, but we had this book. And so this book, I actually thought as a child was the Bible. And the school that I went to that taught Torah to us, the Torah class was called Bible class, and it was with an English Bible. And so I really, as a young child, like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, this book was the be-all and end-all. So I took it absolutely as, it was like given from God. And therefore, especially as a young child, the illustrations were so important to me. And so even now, as an adult, when certain biblical characters are discussed, I'm picturing the illustrations by Laszlo Matule, who had, Moses was wearing a red and yellow turban. And therefore, when I'm sitting in shul now and I hear the Torah portion being read and it talks about Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our father, our teacher, I'm picturing him in that book from childhood. Or I know what Joseph's coat looked like, the beautiful, colorful coat that his father gave him. I know what it looked like because I saw the illustration that Laszlo Matule drew of that coat. I also very much as a child, the only exposure I had to the story about Rachel in the Bible was this one page about Jacob wooing Rachel at the well when she went to water her flock, and she's wearing a purple dress. And so my entire life, when anyone mentions Rachel Imenu, I'm picturing her in that purple dress. So it really made a profound, deep impact on me as a child, because still to this day, I'm picturing the biblical characters the way that one man decided to depict them.
It's amazing how those books can just furnish your imagination for life. You note that your family was not observant and that you were sent to a modern Orthodox day school starting in 8th grade. And you write that to you, Orthodox Judaism was soaked in specialness, which I loved that phrase. What did that mean for you?
I really found it fascinating that all of these families stopped their lives for 24 hours a week for Shabbat. I had never experienced a full Shabbat observant experience before then. And it just felt to me that with that anchoring, everything else sprang from that. And also that every single day at that school, we were praying twice a day. We were doing the morning prayers and doing the afternoon prayers. And I came from a family where we went to synagogue 3 times a year, and not always. Sometimes it was just twice a year, because if the services were really long on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, then my parents were like, we're not going tomorrow also. But we would go then, 10 days later, we would go for Yom Kippur services, often followed by McDonald's afterwards. But don't tell anybody.
Nobody will know now.
Let's just keep it between us.
Yes.
But that's, so then all of a sudden being part of a community that said there is more, there is depth. I really felt that scene in the beginning of The Wizard of Oz where Dorothy opens the door when the house lands and she goes from black and white to this. All of a sudden there was all this color and music and vividness.
You write with Jewish text, and biblical language and storytelling feels so natural to you. And I know you were an educator as well. So I'm wondering if the origins of that were in childhood.
I don't know. I don't know if the origins were in childhood, although I will say that often my parents would talk about how they would peek in my room. I was always very busy. And when I would play, I would have taken all of the pillows in the house and I would have them lined up on my floor and on my bed. And I had stuffed animals behind each one of the pillows because that was my classroom. And that always really spoke to me, the idea of how do you communicate ideas in a more simple way. I actually really struggled in school when I was young. And part of why I thought I wasn't a great student, even at that time, is I thought it's very confusing what they're trying to say. And I thought this can be made easier. So I've always been interested in introductory classes. And so even as a young adult, when I came to Israel and I started taking classes at Pardes, and I would always sign up for the introductory classes for people who had no background. And at that point, I had a lot of background. When I was 22, 23, 24, I already had a lot of background at that point. I had been in Orthodox high school. I had been in Israel for a year. I had been at Brandeis studying Jewish texts. But I am fascinated by how people teach beginners the art of pedagogy is very fascinating to me.
That makes total sense to me. I think the power that you and John had speaking to so many people of so many different backgrounds was making things crystal clear, explaining things that shouldn't have to be explained in that way, about how you can have compassion for all kinds of people. Those things you communicated in just such a direct, clear way that makes sense, that was something how you've been processing for so long. Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood, Jewish Literacy by Rabbi Joseph Telushkin.
I think that Rabbi Telushkin created such a completely accessible and introduction to or reminder of every single thing you might want to know about Judaism. When I was teaching these Introduction to Judaism classes 20 years ago in Richmond, Virginia, people would say, what is the one book that we should have in our house? I would always say, every Jew-curious house should have this book in it. In fact, I said to everybody who I've suggested the book to, start at the very first page, like the introduction or the preface, whatever it is. Even if you read one page a day and it takes you 2 or 3 years to get through the whole book, read every single page of that book. I think he is just the most artful, thoughtful explainer of complex ideas about Judaism. And so I really am probably the president of his fan club, and I've never met him.
I just was wondering about what forms the kind of faith that could withstand what you've experienced. And it feels like books were part of that for you. Was this book part of that foundation of faith for you?
I don't think so, actually. People are often asking about this question about faith. I always had this idea that my mother sort of shared with me when I was really, really little, that there is this very big force that has created everything, that's driving the bus, and we're not going to always understand everything. And my mother had a lot of hardship in her life when she was younger. My grandmother, her mother, also had a lot of challenging hands dealt to her. And I think that that was just their orientation to this very mysterious place that we all find ourselves. So from a very young age, I had this understanding that was explained to me that this is the way the world is. There are going to be things that happen. We're not going to understand them. I'm glad that they created that backdrop for me, because I know for a lot of people, just last week, John and I were speaking to someone who also has been through the ringer with loss since October 7th. And this family was saying, why us? Why us? Why us? And when we got back in the car, John said, why not us? And I thought, like, that's, because we just have a different approach. Like, why not us? It's not that I like it. I've said, you can hate the plan. I hate that Hersh isn't here. I hate that. But it doesn't mean I don't believe. It just means I hate that part, But I wish I could point and say, oh my gosh, it is this that gave me this belief system. And maybe it's just a real naivete. Maybe it's a real childish understanding of the universe. Maybe it's very Pollyannic. I'm not sure, but it is just, it's not something that's wavered even through this most curvy, painful, arduous odyssey upon which we find ourselves. And we will always be here. That's the other thing. I'm really careful with words, and I'm careful with grammar, and I'm careful with tense. So often people will say, wow, you've been through so much. And I think, I'm not through. I'm in it. I am in it. And I recently was rethinking how Robert Frost talks about the only way out is through. And I was thinking about his poem where at the end it says, he's talking about, it's the poem about being in the forest when it's snowing. And he basically wants to lay down in the forest. He wants this to be over. And he says, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep and miles to go before I sleep. And I thought, what does he mean by the only way out is through? Because on the one hand, that sounds really positive, like keep going, like Winston Churchill, when you're in hell, keep going. It's like very rah-rah. And I thought, it actually sounds like the only way out is when you're through with this world. And then I looked up and did some research on Robert Frost and found out that he lost 4 of his children in his lifetime. So Mr. Frost really was very well acquainted with deep-seated mourning and grief. And it made me understand him more. And I think that having this belief system, for me, doesn't take away the pain, but it doesn't make me feel insane with arbitrariness or with a lack of agency. I actually think there is a lot of control within the uncertainty where I live.
Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview. Zen Shorts by John Muth and Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Can you start by telling us a little about the story of the 2 monks?
Sure. So when Hersh was little, my mom gave us this book called Zen Shorts, which are some Zen parables, again, very much given over in a way that's digestible for children. I think there may be 4 or 5 parables in the book, and Hersh's favorite was one that I believe is called The 2 Monks. And it's basically the story of 2 monks. There's a young monk and an old monk, and they're walking, and they're about to pass a carriage that's being carried by some men on their shoulders. And the men put the carriage down, but they still have to sort of hold it close to the ground. And this queen is getting out of the carriage, but there's a huge puddle from where the carriage is until her castle entrance. And what is she to do? And so the old monk goes running over, puts the queen on his back. He trudges through this muddy water, puts her down at her front door. She pushes him out of the way, and she goes into her castle. And the 2 monks continue on their way. And a few hours later, the young monk says to the old monk, I am so irritated. How did that woman not even thank you? And she just pushed you out of the way. It's so horrible. Why didn't you say anything? And the old monk looked at the young monk and said, I put her down 2 hours ago. Why are you still carrying her? And, you know, it's this incredible idea that are we going to let things define us that people don't behave the right way or the situation doesn't go as we want? Do we keep carrying the baggage with us? And you know, Hersh was very much an old monk, and I'm unfortunately a young monk with aspirations to be an old monk. And, you know, I talked to my daughters about this, and John knows about this. John is certainly an old monk. People can be defined in a lot of different ways into different buckets, and Hersh used to do that when he was little. And if he saw, you know, one of his teachers had a sort of a quick temper, he would say, well, she can't help it. She's a young monk. And so I just, that story really stays and resonates with me. Obviously, Man's Search for Meaning comes to mind of something that really has changed the way that I think. Although I will say also another piece, not book, that reminds me a lot of what Viktor Frankl is talking about is one of the seminal works of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, Kol Do Di Dofek, which was originally given in Yiddish as a lecture. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because I think that it's something everyone can read. It's super thick. It's really hard. You need a fork and knife to read it. But I like the idea of, like, if you whittle it down, the basic idea is this going to be fate or is this going to be destiny? And what is the difference between those two experiences in life? And I think about how, you know, fate is just what happens. Meaning we're born and we die. We have no say in either of those. That's what Rabbi Soloveitchik talks about. So I think those, you'll appreciate this, as the book ends. But what you do with the library in between, that is our destiny. And that we can be partners with the universe in deciding whatever happens to us, what are we going to do with our insight, our intellect, our wisdom, our abilities that we have been bestowed with, this godliness that we've been bestowed with as human beings. What are we going to do with the fate that comes our way? Because fate can be very passive. Destiny can be very active. And so that's another piece that I think is very worthwhile, even though it is hard. It is a hard read, which is why I thought maybe we'll talk about Zen shorts instead.
There's so much to unpack in there. It seems to me so clear that Hersh was obviously consumed with these questions of meaning as well, just for virtue of the fact that he picked up Viktor Frankl's book and that obviously it was so meaningful. Can you just tell us a little bit about that remarkable story of how that came to happen?
We didn't know that Hersh had read that book. We found out on the night of 496 when we met Or Levy, who was a hostage who was kidnapped with Hersh and was released after almost 500 days on day 491. Many people remember that because he, Eli Sharabi, and Ohad Ben Ami were released together, and they all looked like they had walked out of a film from 1945, emaciated and very much with a black and white pallor, all of them. And Or asked to meet with John and me, which we didn't understand why, because Or and Hersh didn't know each other. So we didn't understand why he wanted to meet us. And what ended up coming out in that extremely holy conversation that we had in the hospital with Or Levy is that Hersh was constantly mumbling this mantra of when you have a why, you can bear anyhow. When you have a why, you can bear anyhow. And the people in the tunnel who were with him, and Or was one of them, he was saying to them, Viktor Frankl said this in order to help get him through the Holocaust and survive the Holocaust. So if we can all identify what is our why, what is our purpose, what's our meaning, what's our aim, what's our goal, we can get through this how of hell. And when Or was sharing this with us, we didn't know that Hersh had read the book. And also, Eli Sharabi called John after he was released and said, you should know that your son said this line to me from Viktor Frankl. And so it was so revelatory for us that we quickly had to get our hands on the book. I had never read Man's Search for Meaning. So I went and read it. I have it with me. It's always in my bag. It's right here. And that book, very much, for so many different people, different parts speak to different people. Obviously, that line spoke very strongly to Hersh. It stayed with him. Or Levy now has it tattooed on his arm, actually, in English, as like a nod and a wink to Hersh. And there are parts of that book that really speak to John that I didn't notice. There are parts that speak to me that he didn't notice. It's always going to be a tool that we feel that we received, 160 days after Hersh was buried, but from Hersh, a tool saying, here, Mama and Dada, when you have a why, you can bear any how. And the how is, how do we get through the rest of this world without Hersh in it?
It's so meaningful that he read this book, that he was able to share and give that to those other hostages, and that it's impacted so many millions of us who now are thinking about that, because Hersh read that book. It's remarkable. You started to talk about how Frankl wrote it, that idea of the why is what got him through the Holocaust. That's obviously like a parallel that has come up a lot, and you write about a rabbi who said to you, you are the parents of a Holocaust survivor. I saw on Anderson Cooper, he had a Holocaust survivor who spoke to you. How does that land for you?
I find it really validating. I know that a lot of people take issue. I think they feel very uncomfortable with those kind of analogies. Specifically, the rabbi who said that to me in the weeks after Hersh was killed, he himself, both of his parents walked into Auschwitz married to other people with children, both of them. And both of them walked out without their spouses and without any of their children. And then they got married and they had him and his siblings. And so he grew up in a house of really understanding what it means to be a Holocaust survivor. And so coming from him, I really felt that it was so impactful. I think that there's something really remarkable about being able to say, Hersh survived having his arm blown off, being tortured, having burns all over his body, being starved, being filthy, and still staying unbroken from at least what we know. And he really survived until they put a gun on his skin and killed him. And that, I understand that it makes people uncomfortable, the comparison, because pain makes people uncomfortable. And knowing that we as human beings really failed these human beings makes people uncomfortable. But I think sometimes just telling the truth can really be redemptive. And I think we live in a time where even the word truth is no longer an objective term. And we live in a time where we all carry this magical device in our pocket that is an echo chamber that only allows us access to information that we want. And so we all create these truth bubbles. And I thought that it was really very revelatory to have this rabbi and other people, like the woman Irene Weiss, who Anderson Cooper had on his show and who sent us a message. And if these are the people who have walked through Auschwitz and they're telling me that I'm the mother of a Holocaust survivor, I know I am.
I was also just thinking of how you understand Hersh in the context of the Jewish story, Jewish history. You know, you write about the introduction from Rabbi Harold Kushner to the copy of Man's Search for Meaning that you picked up, that you understood that Hersh was taking in the wisdom that helped another Jew at another time in history. I'm just wondering about that, especially as we approach Tisha B'Av.
I think there's this grand tapestry that we're all part of. And it's strange and interesting that Hersh is now known. Someone just said to me last week, I mean, he's the only one who was taken alive from the bomb shelter where he was, who was returned not alive. He's the only American who was taken alive, who was held alive, who was killed in captivity and then given back in a bag. There are a lot of really interesting sort of facts, no matter how we want to coat or paint this. And on the other hand, this is the Jewish story, tragically. The blip in the story is the past 70 years in North America, living a golden age for Jews. But aside from that, we've had a really rough go, we Jewish people. And Hersh, I'm glad, was always fascinated by history, always reading history books, but especially he was drawn to the Holocaust and World War II for whatever reasons. But he also really read extensively about the Civil War and the presidents and Native Americans. And there's always a temptation to lionize and mythologize and heroicize young people when they're killed. John says that's so that we can handle the fact that we allow young people to be killed. If we make them into heroes, then it's okay. And we try really hard not to do that with Hersh. Hersh's extraordinariness is that he was absolutely ordinary. He was the son of John and Rachel, and we are absolutely ordinary. And I mean, I've always said, I'm Rachel Goldberg. I'm the Jane Doe of Jewish women. I mean, what happened to Hersh was horrific. And what's happened to many millions of us along the way on the road of Jewish history has been horrific. Unfortunately, it's part of our story. I'm not accepting it. I don't lay down and say, oh, okay, so this is the way it's going to be. But we have been thrust into this not unique situation of having supreme violence and tragedy befall us. But as you mentioned, and that will, all of us will be talking about, and the weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av, which is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, this is part of, braided into the Jewish story, that there is pain and loss, and we own it. What I like about Tisha B'Av is that we're not pretending. We're saying these terrible things happened, here are what they are. And what I really like about Tisha B'Av is when we talk about what responsibilities we personally played in a lot of those unfortunate events that befell us. And I think that that is part of the DNA of the Jewish people. And I hope we don't lose that.
Book 4, the book you're reading now. Table for Two by Amor Towles and The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller.
I only read fiction. My life is nonfiction. I love long books. I don't usually like short stories because I feel like they're a tease. But I do have to say I just read Amor Towles' Table for Two, which was short stories. I accidentally read it because I didn't know it was short stories, so I thought it was a book. And then I was like, how does this first chapter, which was amazing, go with this first paragraph of this second chapter? And then I realized what had happened. But that was incredible. I will say that sadly, I like sad books. I do like sad books. I just read, a friend lent me The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller, and I thought that the writing was just shiveringly gorgeous. I kept rereading lines over and over and over and just thinking, how in the world does he do this?
Does reading still feel like an escape for you?
Reading is helpful. Yeah. It's definitely an escape, and I do always have a book. And Hersh always had a book, which is why that was part of also what made me insane. And I wasn't reading while he was alive, because I thought if he can't be reading, then I'm not reading. And we both were such voracious readers always. And that was why, when I stuck my head in his room on October 6th, when he was packing before we left for shul, before he brought his camping backpack, because he knew he was going from shul to Shabbat dinner to go meet his best friend Aner to go camping, he said to me, should I bring my book? I'm only going for a night. And so he was holding his book, and he put it back down on his nightstand, and it is still there right this second. And it is The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama. And his bookmark is still in chapter 6.
And I know you heard later that he was reading another book.
Right. So Or Levy shared with us that when Hersh and Ori Danino were brought into the tunnel where Or Levy was being held with the others, that they couldn't believe it because Hersh walked in and everybody only had a mat that they carried from tunnel to tunnel that they slept on. They noticed that Hersh's mat was different colored than everybody else's. Everyone else's was very dirty and gray. Hersh's was kind of a maroon color, which they ended up finding out is because it was all the blood that had been soaked into it in the first 3 days after his arm had been blown off. And he continued using that mat for the rest of his captivity. And he, under his arm, was carrying a book. And everybody said, what? What is that? Because everyone was bored out of their mind and losing their marbles. And he walks in with a book. And he said he had talked to his captors at a certain point and explained, I need a book. You need to get me any book. And he always preferred reading in English, always. And they found somewhere in Gaza a copy of a book called Shadow and Bone by Lee Bardugo. He had at that point already read it over 20 times because it was the only thing he had. But he had to be reading. And then when he left that tunnel, he, Ori Danino, and Elmo Sarusi were told, you're going home. And one of the captors, Eliad Cohen, told us that the captor said to Hersh, smile, you're going to see your mother today. And so Hersh left the book for Or-Levi. And that book then became the book that those four who were held together, or Eli Sharabi, Eliad Cohen, and Alon, were reading that book again and again and again and having a book club in the tunnels of Gaza. And when Eliad Cohen met me, he came over and he said, I speak English because of your son. And he gave me a big hug because Or-Levi taught Eliad how to read English because of that book. That was all they had. So for many hours a day, when you're bored, you read or you teach people to read. And that was how Eliad Cohen learned how to read English.
And you haven't read that book yet?
No, I bought it, but it's just on my shelf. I haven't read it yet.
Book 5, the author's latest book, When We See You Again, by Rachel Goldberg-Polin. For 330 days, you were moving mountains and trying to save Hersh and talking so much on the news and to all of us and at the DNC, everywhere. And now you're talking, after the worst has happened. And does it feel like reliving a trauma, or are you there in your head anyway? So maybe it's a relief to just go straight there.
It's a good question. Someone was just asking me yesterday about what are we doing for Hersh's Yortzeit this year, which falls on the English calendar. It falls on Saturday, August 8th. And it's so interesting because this friend was saying, I feel really bad. We're not going to be here then. And I know it's such a hard day. And I said, every single day is his Yortzeit for me. Every single second of my life is Hersh's Yortzeit. The grief is right here at all times. I don't have 1 second, not 1 second when I'm awake, when I don't feel that there is a branding iron on my back. So whether I'm running and the branding iron's on my back, or I'm sitting and the branding iron's on my back, it's the same back and it's the same branding iron. And I spoke recently somewhere about how, Jewish people, we say 4 times a year, we say the special memorial prayer called Yizkor, right, which means remember, kind of in the command form, you will remember, Yizkor. And we say that prayer for our 7 closest relatives, for our mother, father, brother, sister, spouse, son, daughter. That prayer takes maybe 2 minutes to say. So we need 8 minutes a year where we're saying this prayer. And I thought, I think it's so twisted to insinuate that any parent who has buried a child needs 8 more minutes to think about, to remember their child. There's not 1 second of my life that I am not thinking of Hersh. Not 1 second, not one. And so what I would really like is 8 minutes a year where I don't have to think about it. I wish I could have, a lobotomy or amnesia for just 8 minutes. And so when we're going out right at this moment and talking a lot about the book, it's not bad and it's not good. I think it's probably more positive than just neutral, because I think giving over even a molecule of the pain is helpful. But I don't know. I think it is, but I don't know.
You write about how excruciating Shiva was and how at some point, as thousands of people are coming to visit you, you felt like, I get it now. This is for them. It wasn't for you. Does this book feel like that for you? Does this feel like it's for you? It's for us?
the book felt much more for me. Because again, when I was writing it for me. And so the things that happen by accident along the way that are positive are really nice. Like, I think people go into any book with whatever glasses they're wearing. So if someone's going into any book angry, they're going to find anger. If someone goes into a book feeling love, they're going to find love. If they want hope, they'll find hope. If they want strength, they'll find strength. If they want pain, they'll find pain. And so it's interesting to me that people have told me what they think the book is doused in or comprised of. And I like that some people have said, I really feel like I know Hersh so much more. Or I feel like I understand your pain so much more. And I didn't set out to do that, but it's not a bad thing, I don't think. And yet I'm trying to be very careful when I'm talking about it, because I'm very aware that what works for me does not work for everyone, even within my family. So like, for sure, not within the, larger world of grief. And even within the October 7th world of grief, I have a friend who lost a daughter in the aftermath of October 7th. And she said, if she goes to the grocery store and every single person there does not stop and ask her how she is, it hurts her. And I thought it's so interesting because, as you know, because I said in the beginning of our conversation, when people ask me how I am, to me it seems, I feel like, are you insane? Like, how do you not see this giant cleaver sticking out of my chest? How could you possibly ask me how I am? And so, you have two completely different needs to the same situation of loss. And I think about it even within my family. I think about John and my daughters and I were in the same exact car that was hit by the same exact train. Some of our injuries are similar. Maybe we all have broken arms. And then maybe one person lost an eye and one person broke their foot and one person burned their, side. But even those arms are going to heal at different rates and different speeds because we are different people and we got into the car as different people and in different shape emotionally, psychologically, physically, spiritually, and so maybe we have to have that arm amputated. Maybe we have to have that arm always in a certain sling. Maybe we're never going to be able to write properly. I don't know. And maybe we'll become professional baseball pitchers. You just never know how you're going to come out of something. And so it's very much, the book is me speaking about my experience. And I want to be careful because it's not a how-to. It's not a how to go from being broken to, this other realm, which I wish it was. I wish I did know that. Although I recently heard an amazing little clip from Rabbi Shlomo Yehuda Be'eri Shlita, who talked about if somebody gives you an answer to something as big as that, they're lying. If someone says, you're in so much pain, let me tell you how to do it, run. Because that someone would have the haughtiness to think that they know how to cure what ails you is a sign that you are being sold a bunch of hooey and you should run.
I was so moved by the series of dreams that you shared and the writing that Hersh had written many years before. It felt like your family was so spiritually attuned and sensitive. I was thinking of the teaching from the Zohar that a soul knows that it's going to die 30 days before and is preparing, and that your family seemed to know that something terrible was coming on a soul level. I wondered if you could share a little bit about that and how you understand it.
I always get very suspicious of people who share their dreams, especially in books, because I think you are making that up. And that's why I was so glad that with each of the dreams that I shared, I had given dream testimony upon waking to others. And I thought, wow, that was a horrific dream. Now, I also the issue was that for those 330 days when Hersh was stolen, I never used to dream, even though before October 7th, I was like a very active dreamer. But then on a Saturday morning, I woke up and I thought that was a terrible dream that I just had. Should I tell John the dream? And I decided to tell him the dream. And I told him that I had this dream that I was walking through a cemetery and there were planks on the floor, sort of like wooden planks. And I could see that there was a little olive tree growing up between the planks, and there was a plaque on the tree to mark where someone was buried underneath. And I went over, and Hersh's name was on the plaque. And they came that night to tell us that he was killed. You know, his death was so horrific. I wasn't thinking, oh my gosh, that's weird. I dreamt that 12 hours ago. But I do think that dreams can be so revealing. And I have a friend who's a psychiatrist who said, and I talk about him in the book actually, but he said so many of his patients come to him and say, I had this dream, explain this dream to me. And he always says, only you can explain your dreams, and you know exactly why you dreamed it. And I think that's really powerful.
It's clear how meaningful Jewish ritual has been in your life, how meaningful Shabbat has been in your life. And I know that for those 330 days, Shabbat looked a lot different for you. You were busy in the work of trying to save Hersh's life. I wonder what it was like for you to step back into Shabbat. What rituals feel meaningful for you right now?
Shabbat is still really challenging. Everything is really challenging in this ever after. Shabbat didn't go back in any way to the Shabbat from the before, unfortunately. When I light candles now, and I of course still light 3 candles, people have the tradition of lighting 2 candles for Shabbat, and then for every child that we bring into the world, we light an additional candle. There's a tradition because every child brings additional light. So of course I'm still lighting 3 candles because Hersh's light will always be still illuminating my life, even in his absence. But the first thing that I do when I light the candles is I actually put my hands out and I give Hersh the blessing that I would normally give him on a Friday night. I give that to him still. And then I beg him. There's an idea in Judaism that part of why Shabbat can feel so full to us is that we have an extra soul with us all during Shabbat. And that sort of springs from a Kabbalistic idea that when Jacob died, Jacob the forefather, there was Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Jacob's name had been changed during his life to Israel, to Yisrael. So when Yisrael dies, it says he dies, but it never says that Jacob died. And so there's a song that many families sing on Friday nights after dinner that says, Nachalat Yaakov Yirash, that Jacob's inheritance is with you on Shabbat, that there's like this extra soul with you. So what I say to Hersh when I light the candles, I say, Nachalat Hersh Yirash. I say, wrap your soul around me so that I can have a good Shabbat. Guard, shield, protect, and defend me from the pain so that I can have a good Shabbat. And I usually can, but it takes a lot of acrobatics. We don't do what we used to do yet. And the yet is the hope, right? I say yet at the end of sentences like that. We're still extremely shattered and broken and not functioning and disordered. And I read an article from the American Psychiatric Association talking about if you're still grieving for a loved one after 6 months, you have a disorder. And I thought, yes, I do. And then it said, if you're still grieving after a year, you have a very bad disorder. And I thought, that's the one I have, the very bad one. I think a lot of it is that ununique loss that so many of us suffer when someone core to our DNA and to who we identify as in this world is no longer here. But I do think that I'm very, very damaged from those 330 days that I was suppressing so much trauma and torture. I asked, you mentioned Anderson Cooper before. I asked him because he dealt with some very severe loss in his life, and he tried compartmentalizing it for many, many, many years. And I said, can I do that? And he said, oh, it totally ruined my life. So, because I say that to my therapist, I say, like, I don't want to unpack those 330 days. Those were horrific days. And this is already horrific enough, dealing with Hersh not being here and the loss and the grief that's constant and always with me. You know, this huge gorilla in my lap that I didn't invite that's here, even though I also recognize that grief is this huge privilege that we only experience for people we love. So, you know, the pain is the love that is continuing to grow in the absence of this boy who I adore. So there's so many balls that I'm juggling that Shabbat is no longer at all what it once was. But what I'm trying to do now is in Lecha Dodi, which is one of the songs that we sing Friday night in synagogue when we're welcoming Shabbat, the second verse says, Likrat Shabbat lechu v'nilcha, you know, come, we're going to go greet Shabbat. Ki hi makor habracha, because Shabbat is the essence, the soul, the source, the core of all of our blessings. That verse always meant a lot to me, but what I'm trying to do now is move on to the third verse, which says, Rav lach shevet be'emek habacha. You've sat too long in the valley of tears. V'hu yachmal alai chemla. And God is going to compassion you with compassion. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, translates that gorgeously as he's going to shower you with compassion. But I like to do it literally and translate it as he's going to compassion you with compassion. And that's where I'm trying to get to that verse, because I would like for Shabbat to be similar to what Shabbat was. And I'm praying that I get there. But I'm definitely not there yet.
I think we are all, you know, and I don't know if it lands as feeling when people wish that for you, as it feels like they're wishing something that is unreasonable to hope that for you. But I think that is what we feel. You know, you've shared Hersh with us so beautifully that so many of us miss him on a core level, not having known him. So I thank you for trusting us and trusting readers with your grief. And I know that so many people are living with greater purpose and greater compassion because of his words, because of the way that you've shared him with us, you and John. So I thank you, and may Hersh's memory continue to be a revolution. Thank
Amen.
you so much for being here.
Thank you, Tali. I appreciate you carving out the time for me.
Thank you so much for joining us today on The Five Books. Our guest today was Rachel Goldberg-Polin, talking about her book, When We See You Again. If you want to share your thoughts sparked by this episode, we'd love to hear about it. Drop us a comment on our Instagram @5bookspod or to our email team@5bookspod.org. We also have a newsletter. We'll send you an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes and links to all the books we discussed, and even more Jewish book recommendations. You can sign up for the newsletter in our show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Amelia Merrill. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Alad Lifshitz of the Dove Abramson Studio. Thanks especially to Jennifer Joel, Matt Krieger, Rebecca Ash, and thank you to the Jewish Book Council and to Felicia Herman and David Ben-Or.